Does Canada get to win? Or I hope so. So our next panel, coming up as we're setting up seats, we have Minister LeBlanc, who is leading the trade talks, of course, for Canada with the U.S. And of course, we're coming up against this milestone, as they're calling it, July 1st, that review period, what happens to CUSMA, and of course, what happens to USMCA. So let's welcome to the stage Minister LeBlanc, who is a former finance minister and now the Minister for Canada-U.S Trade. And in this session, he'll be moderated by Christopher Sands, Director, Center for Canadian Studies, Johns Hopkins.
I'll go around. I'll go.
Unless you want to switch.
Still early. I have a coffee with me, Christopher. I saw you vacuum up 3 cups back there.
Well, I do like coffee. There's no doubt about that. So I wanted to start, Minister LeBlanc. Last week, I saw you talking at the Canadian Embassy about your meeting with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and you expressed optimism, and optimism about the trade talks and where we might go. And I was impressed by that, so I went ahead and started writing and thinking, well, is he crazy? No, actually, I could see this working out.
Well, they could both be true.
They can both be true. But with that in mind, why are you optimistic? And are you crazy or am I wrong? Which way would you call it?
Or all three. Christopher, so thank you for having me here. Thanks to the Eurasia Group and the Royal Bank of Canada. I have some longtime friends that are very active at the Eurasia Group, and I've had a chance to work with Dave Mackay also, so it's a privilege for me to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Christopher, Janice Charette and I spent an hour with Ambassador Greer last week. I've subsequently exchanged a series of messages with him, including yesterday. I'm going to see him on the margins of the G7 next week in France. He had given me an hour in a video conversation on Memorial Day a week before our in-person meeting. We're doing the important work of answering some of the long-standing concerns that the United States has publicly spoken about in terms of non-tariff barriers. So their annual trades estimate publication that lists every country and things that they think are unfair in terms of trade practices, some of which are in federal jurisdiction, a few of which would be properly in provincial jurisdiction in Canada. But Madame Charette and I got there last week with Ambassador Greer and his Deputy Ambassador Getman, and went through well over, in the double digits, of precise things that the Americans had asked us to address that we have addressed. We talked about other issues, and many of these are in Canada's economic interest to resolve quickly as well. So we're doing that work. We have been for a number of weeks, but I had a sense that Ambassador Greer and his colleagues saw the progress that they have been looking for. We talked to them about things that Canada also wants to address, because it's not a one-way street. But I had a sense after that conversation, and in the subsequent exchanges between Jamieson and me, or Janice and Jeff Getman, Ambassador Wiseman picks up the same thing. I have a sense that there's a desire to get us on a track where we can have a bilateral conversation on these issues. At the same time, and I read what you had written after that as well, have a bilateral conversation that addresses these issues. Mexico's doing that. Right. Ambassador Greer has said, so is Howard Lutnick, that there are bilateral issues that the two countries can discuss, right, while we can also do what's necessary in the context of a review of the trilateral agreement as well.
That's fantastic. And very much on point. I saw Janice Charette earlier this week at the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association's Canada Automotive Summit. And she said that one of the things that was on the conversation was this issue of trade balance. And the president referred to it the other day, that Canada has a trade surplus. Part of that's energy, but he does keep talking about trade imbalances. How do you manage that issue?
By discussing directly with American officials the facts, It starts by having a common understanding of the numbers. I saw Prime Minister Carney have that conversation with President Trump at the White House on a couple of occasions. If you take out energy, of course, there's a trade surplus in the United States' favor. The directional change over the last year has been in the United States' favor. But the challenge also, if Christopher, what we've said, and I've said it publicly, we've said it privately in our conversations with American secretaries or the Prime Minister with the President, for decades, going back to Mr. Mulroney and President Reagan, there has been this integration of the North American economy, more obvious in certain sectors than others. But as a general principle, all three countries have seen greater prosperity and sustained economic growth because of the advantage of having these integrated economic relationships. So you come along and you sort of try and change 3-4 decades in a formula, which has been, and this is our view, in the interest of all three economies. You're going to find certain sectors at certain moments that are under much more pressure. But at the end of the day, geography has given Canada one neighbor. We share so many values and so many objectives globally. There are decades of family relationships, business relationships. I don't think there's any Canadian who doesn't have a personal connection to the United States. Is it because, like me, I was studied there? Is it because you have family that live there? I have 5 cousins that live in Massachusetts, and many more Cajuns that would live in Louisiana, I guess. I met about 3,000 LeBlancs, had a picnic in Lafayette 25 years ago. I went with my dad in Erath outside Lafayette. So, but the connections, the business connections, the cultural connections, and it is a happy story. I think we should be the most reliable security partners. I was Minister of Public Safety in Canada. The Five Eyes relationship. We have border services agents embedded with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol in the United States, as they do in Canada. Today, there are patrols on the St. Clair River where you'll have a Canadian and an American border enforcement officer in the same boat.
Right, the shipyard
literally.
Program, yeah.
Yeah, so there's so many positive things. President Trump ran an election campaign to impose tariffs. He won convincingly. And he's implementing the agenda that he told Americans he would if he was elected. So I'm always surprised when people are shocked that politicians keep their promises. Like they're, oh my God, he's doing what? So our job is not to get destabilized by this. Our job is to work in Canada's economic interest, accepting, as Mr. Carney said, that President Trump is going to proceed in this direction. How can we ensure that Canada's economy remains competitive? How can we ensure that we're more resilient? But how can we make the case to Americans, and this is something that I'm convinced in the end will be successful, that it's a different circumstance than importing something on a boat from Asia. And I think we'll get to a place, I hope soon, where there's more predictability and more certainty. But President Trump's style is not one to give eternal certainty. So again, our job is to accept that and do what we have to ensure that Canadian business and the Canadian economy navigate through that.
I think it's fair to say the president likes to keep his negotiating partners slightly off balance. And we've seen him talk about Canada's potential inflation, its growth. He's weighed in with the 51st state comments. And one of your fellow New Brunswickers, Frank McKenna, talked about the problem of Canadians feeling quite hurt by some of the things that are said. How do you negotiate with this kind of pressure? And a lot of Canadians, I think, are worried that the deal will be too generous or that it won't include an apology for all the things that are said. That's got to make your job harder. Yeah,
I have no illusions that we're going to get an apology for...
You heard it here first.
No, but Christopher, and you're right. I've said, and I've said this to Secretary Lutnick, to Ambassador Greer, Ambassador Hoekstra and I have chatted about this. American political leaders will prosecute their domestic American politics in the way they choose. Canada should not be emotionally vested in how American politicians speak to American voters. Our job is to ensure that the long-term economic interest of Canada, which is inevitably tied to a successful trading relationship with the United States, is in the best possible position. So you're right, President Trump is an experienced negotiator. He has a style that's unique to a category of one. And that's fine. I'm encouraged because in the conversations I've seen between the Prime Minister and the President, and the Prime Minister sometimes talks to us about quite an active, informal conversation that he maintains with the President. They're very businesslike. They're focused on common economic interests, security interests. My conversations with Ambassador Greer or Secretary Lutnick, again, as recently as this week, he and Ambassador Wiseman and Ambassador Hoekstra and I had a conversation. It's focused on business issues. It's cordial and it's constructive. We just need to keep moving. The President said in one meeting, we keep having to move down the field and put points on the board. That was the President's phrase in a meeting I was in, and we don't disagree with that.
No. I know you worked for a while for Jean Chrétien, and I remember him talking about the issue with Quebec, and that sometimes it was like having a car stuck in the snow. You kind of rocked it forward, rocked it backward until you got enough momentum to get out. Are you finding that it's a little bit the dynamic that we're in with regard to these negotiations, particularly on the USMCA? And I want to throw in also Mexico, because you've been down to Mexico several times. It is a trilateral discussion, and so what's that dynamic? Is that fair to say you're rocking back and forth, but don't panic?
So that's a good analogy. I remember Mr. Chrétien at the news conference using that expression. I think the phrase was, "We Canadians know what to do when we get stuck in the snow." But you got to have a good set of snow tires on.
True.
You got to make sure that somebody doesn't hit you when you're on the shoulder. So all of that is true. We said backstage a minute ago, Christopher, I have a New Brunswick business friend that has an expression that when you're going through turbulence, you don't take off your seatbelt, run up and down the aisle and kick in the cockpit door and start pulling the levers and pushing the buttons. So we're remaining firmly seated and we're focused on getting through this inevitable turbulence. I'm optimistic because back to the trilateral conversation, we have the Prime Minister and President Sheinbaum last September signed an agreement to deepen the bilateral economic relationship between Canada and Mexico. Because the biggest economy in the world is sort of in the middle of the two of us, it tended to go through the United States. The supply chain integrations are real, but actual sort of direct bilateral trade certainly hasn't grown at the level that it could have. That is a focus for us. You're right, we've had business delegations, big Canadian business delegations in 3 cities in Mexico in February. They reciprocated in Toronto and Montreal last month. And we're very active with the Mexicans in talking to our American partners around the trilateral arrangement. Ambassador Greer has said this, there's some confusion. I try and demystify this July 1st deadline.
Right.
It's not a cliff that everybody goes hurtling off. It's a moment where the 3 countries could decide to extend the agreement by adding 6 more years, so 16 years. And if on July 2nd we haven't done that, the agreement remains in place for another 10 years, and there are these annual reviews. Back to what you said earlier about President Trump liking a certain level of uncertainty, which keeps people off balance. I'm not surprised that Ambassador Greer has said publicly that it's very unlikely that he'll rubber stamp the agreement on July 1st. In fact, they've scheduled technical negotiations with the Mexicans in July. But the three countries can at any point thereafter agree to extend the treaty as well. So I would expect that we'll have bilateral arrangements between Canada and the United States, between the United States and Mexico, sort of adjacent to the trilateral framework. If those agreements resolve issues that all three countries are trying to resolve, I'm hopeful that we might at that point have the extension. But if not, we'll continue to do what's necessary to preserve the trilateral framework, which is in the interest of all three countries.
Sure. Well, you've been down to Washington almost more than I am in Washington, and I live there. If you were to kind of close us out a little bit, what is it that most Canadians, and this is an audience of Canadians at a very sophisticated level, but having been down, having dealt with this administration, but also dealt with Americans, what would you say your insight is in terms of what you've learned about the United States and Washington politics today that maybe Canadians don't know, don't realize, because they haven't had as much time to interact as you have?
I think that's a great question to close. I'm always inspired and reassured by American business leaders, legislators, people in the administration who very much recognize the benefit of a stable, growing economic and security relationship between Canada and the United States. We have a lot of friends in the United States, Canada does. As I said a minute ago, in some cases it's very personal. In some cases it's long-standing business relationships. We say to American business leaders and to Canadian business leaders who have customers or business partners in the United States, the most important voices for President Trump and Ambassador Greer and Secretary Lutnick and others, Secretary Bessent to hear, are the voices of American business leaders and American workers that can say to Americans that this relationship benefits all three countries, but in our case, Canada and the United States. So that gives me back to your very insightful article, which you published on June 3rd. It was a fantastic article.
Very nice.
Because my name was in the title. That's why I thought it was excellent. It was excellent. It got huge pickup, huge pickup. But that's probably why, as you said in that article, I remain optimistic. The Prime Minister is prepared to do the work we need to do. And I'll finish with this. We're not waiting for that process as an idle spectator. Right. We have put before the United States, before President Trump, some very specific offers that we think are in the interest of the United States economy and the Canadian economy. The Prime Minister has done that on a number of occasions in the last number of months. I did it in a more technical way with Ambassador Greer. So we'll continue to do that work. But at the same time, we're getting on with building a Canadian economy that's strong and resilient and diversified. Because as the Prime Minister said in New York, and I will finish with this, if we want to be a valuable security and economic partner for the United States, because it's in Canada's interest to be, if we do so from a position of a strong, growing, resilient, diversified economy, building big things again, being open to the world, we'll be a better North American economic partner.
Dominic LeBlanc, I feel like Canada-U.S. relations is in good hands.
Oof,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
It was good hands. You did great.
Well, that was encouraging. So there's room for compromise and negotiation is what you're saying, Minister LeBlanc.
What did you say? Compromise?
Compromise, negotiation for the renewal of USMCA.
You won't have politicians standing around talking about the compromises they're making. It's all principle-based. What are you talking about? It's all principle-based. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Now, so we finish up the morning session.